What are the varieties of spiritual experiences? This is really the question that I want to address today. How do we try to understand what spiritual experiences are all about? What are their actual core components and elements of them? How can we study them? How can we look at them from a neuroscientific perspective? And all of this gets to be put into a larger, integrative, multidisciplinary approach that is sometimes referred to as neurotheology, something which I also hope to tell you a little bit about as I go through my presentation today. So let us start with that first question. What exactly are spiritual experiences? And of course, many of you are very well aware of different types of spiritual experiences, mystical experiences. And if you go to the internet, if you go to the literature, there are lots of different terms that people use. And sometimes they can be more about wisdom and knowledge. Sometimes they can be about an actual experience itself, a sense of oneness or unity. Sometimes it has to do with the transformational aspects or a sense of awakening. And there can even be very rational cognitive elements as well that even border on the scientific. So, part of what to me is so exciting about the study of spiritual experiences is the wide array and diversity of them, how they seem to affect people on many different levels. And of course, as someone who comes at it from this neurotheological perspective, how can we start to link these different ideas, these different aspects of spiritual experiences to what's going on in our brain? Is there a relationship? Can we understand what that relationship is? And does this idea about how the brain is involved in these experiences in some way, does that provide an additional perspective to what we already can talk about in the context of the spiritual, the theological, the philosophical implications of what these experiences are ultimately all about? Now, I've already started to use the term spiritual experiences. Of course, this whole concept of the varieties of spiritual experience, which is now part of the most recent book that I have published called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. But this derives from an earlier book by the very well-known William James, a very famous book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And of course, that whole discussion about the relationship between spirituality and religiousness, how they intersect, overlap, how they may differentiate themselves, in and of itself is a very important concept for us to think about. In fact, in an earlier work called The Principles of Neurotheology that I published, I talk a lot about the importance of definitions and how we develop definitions, where these definitions come from, and how we can actually continue to evolve those definitions as we learn more, as we develop better scholarship, as we develop new research projects. So on one hand, it's important to think about ways of developing operational definitions, meaning that, is there something that helps us to tie the spiritual or the religious into something that might be observable, that we can kind of get a hold of from a scientific perspective? This is not always easy to do. And of course, what I also mean by this is if somebody were to say, well, a spiritual experience is the expression of the soul, for example, that may be a very valid spiritual definition for that term, but we have no way of measuring the soul, at least not that we know of yet, from a scientific perspective. So we want to try to get at things like thoughts and feelings and experiences. That's a way of making this kind of a definition more operational. On one hand, we want to get very tight definitions, very narrow definitions, so we know exactly what we're talking about. But on the other hand, if we get too narrow with certain definitions, then we might exclude huge groups of individuals. For example, if we define religion or religiousness as finding a connection with God of some kind, then what do we do with 500 million Buddhists out there who don't necessarily believe in God in the Judeo-Christian concept, but perhaps have a very deep religious or spiritual life? So we have to think about how to make our definitions not too narrow. On the other hand, if we get too broad, well, then sometimes we start including things that maybe really shouldn't be included in this discussion. What do we do with things like cults, for example, or even an individual's own belief system? Can that be called a religion, or is that something spiritual? How do we start to think about these different aspects of these terms? Now, I think it also becomes important for us to differentiate different elements that may be part of religious or spiritual beliefs and experiences. For example, there is the spiritual, there is the religious elements themselves, which we've just been talking about, but there can be other aspects, including a sense of well-being, a sense of meaning and purpose, the various emotions and cognitive processes that all come into play when it comes to these experiences. And then ultimately, if we have, whatever definitions we're starting with, we have an ability to then develop some type of measurement tool. We can ask certain questions. We might be able to apply certain scientific techniques or modalities to study these kinds of experiences. And then again, it's a continual evolution of understanding what these things are, trying to study them, and then revising what we know about them and to keep going. So to me, it's a very exciting area. It's a very exciting field that gives us an opportunity to continue to understand what, from my view, are some of the most powerful, most important kinds of experiences that human beings can have. Now, one last thing I want to say about definitions just goes back to a conference that I was involved in back about 20 years ago, where we were actually tasked with trying to understand the relationship between spirituality and health. And this group of about 80 scientists said, well, we obviously have to make these definitions. We have to understand at least what we mean by spirituality and religion. So I'm going to offer these to you. I don't necessarily say these are the best. There are certain pros and cons with these particular definitions, but I want to at least give you an opportunity to think about them a little bit and to think about how you yourself may define these particular terms. In fact, it's a great exercise to do, whether by yourself or with others, to say, what do we really mean by these particular terms? So this group of scientists, very high level, many funded by the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation and so forth, came up with these criteria for spirituality. They described the criteria for spirituality as the subjective feelings, thoughts, experiences, and behaviors that arise from a search or quest for the sacred. So on one hand, this becomes very operationalized. There's feelings, thoughts, and experiences that I can ask a question about. And then they have certain terms that narrow this definition, search and quest, but they expand those terms so that there's a certain broadness to it. So search refers to the attempts to identify, articulate, maintain, or transform. And sacred refers to whatever a given individual perceives as a divine being, God, ultimate reality, something along those lines. So again, there's a certain value to this. This is certainly not the only kind of definition that we could apply here. And one of the points I made a few moments ago is, where do we get these definitions from? This is a group of scientists. We might get to a very different type of definition if we spoke to a group of clergy, a group of theologians, a group of philosophers, a group of sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists. So, there's a lot of different groups that all could potentially have something to say about what these definitions should be. And again, I think there'll be a continued evolution of these kinds of definitions. Now, this particular group of scientists differentiated the spiritual definition to the criteria of religiousness, which included the criteria for spirituality and or a search for non-sacred goals. As I mentioned a few moments ago, things like meaning, purpose, well-being, and so forth, although typically in the context of something spiritual. One of the most common aspects that typically defines religiousness in this way is that the means and methods of that whole process have general validation by a group of people. So there are a group of people who say, this is what it means to be Muslim. This is what it means to be Jewish. This is what it means to be Buddhist. And at least there's that sort of group of people who say that. But again, even within those particular traditions, there can be multiple variations, multiple subgroups, and so forth. So there's a lot to be, said for this, but there's also, this has to be taken with a grain of salt. And of course, various spiritual approaches also can be supported by a group of people and maybe not necessarily referred to as a religion. So lots of very fascinating aspects. And the last thing I'll say about this in terms of definitions is that if you do just kind of canvass the population, there are people who consider themselves both religious and spiritual. There are people who consider themselves to be spiritual but not religious, a very growing group these days. There are people who consider themselves religious and not spiritual. And then, of course, there's the agnostic or atheist individuals who will say, I'm neither religious nor spiritual. So again, there's a whole combination of interrelationships between religiousness and spirituality that are important for us to at least keep in the back of our mind mind as we explore what spiritual experiences are all about. Now, what are the types of spiritual experiences? Well, there's several different ways of categorizing these experiences, and I'm going to kind of cover them today. So, for example, one way to do it in a very broad context is to look at a kind of continuum, if you will, going from what might be considered the everyday experience, going into a church, a synagogue, a mosque, and just, feeling that sense of spirituality, that sense of religiousness be a part of you. I would call that a kind of everyday experience. It isn't really an altered state of consciousness. It's not some big mystical experience, but nonetheless, it still can be a very important part of the person's life. Many people talk about creativity and aesthetics, architecture, being in nature, and so forth. This is another grouping of experiences that people talk about. In fact, in a lot of my presentations, people will come up to me and say, my spirituality is my art, my music, or something along those lines. And so, on one hand, I think, even for people who say I'm an atheist, I don't necessarily believe in the supernatural, there is still that drive to connect with yourself, to connect with the world around you, to find answers, and so forth. And that can be expressed in a variety of different approaches. There are various meditative and prayer type of practices, various, other types of spiritual interventions, processes, approaches that can be part of these experiences and lead to those experiences. And of course, these are the practices that frequently lead to very intense religious or spiritual experiences, which ultimately can progress to perhaps what might be referred to as mystical or enlightenment types of experiences. And again, you're getting a little bit of a sense just on a very broad scale that there might be some sort of continuum of these experiences. And some have talked a lot about what these experiences may be, perhaps along some kind of mystical or unitary continuum where you have, as this figure demonstrates, you have sort of yourself and the world in kind of our everyday life. And then as you kind of progress down this continuum, you get to greater and greater senses of connection, oneness, and so forth, ultimately to these very peak mystical experiences. Now, I always am a little reluctant about having these kinds of drawings because I don't mean to have these be hierarchical per se, although certainly that is sometimes considered in that regard. And again, from a neurotheological perspective, it could be very interesting to think a little bit more about what this continuum may be. What are the elements of this continuum? Is it purely a sense of oneness? Are there are there other continuums that have to do with the emotionality, with the cognitive elements, with other experiential pieces of this? So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this, not just having to be a kind of unitary aspect of this, but although that's certainly an important part, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, of course, spiritual experiences could be categorized according to the tradition. So almost every tradition has expressed some type of fairly intense spiritual, mystical experience. And certainly in the monotheistic traditions, in Judaism through Kabbalistic training and practices, there is this notion of a mystical union with God as the emphasis. And this mystical union of God is perhaps a somewhat key aspect of many of the monotheistic traditions, because there is the belief in God and the idea that part of what the ultimate goal of humanity is to create that connection with God and regain that connection with God in a very intensive way. We can see this similarly in Christianity and Sufism, the Muslim sect of the Muslim mystical sect. Again, the sense of union with God through Quranic teachings, through the surrender to God. In Christianity, it is through Christian-based practices and a connection with Jesus and so forth. In the monotheistic traditions, we don't typically see the term enlightenment used that much, although intriguingly, in many cases in the Bible, for example, when someone does have that kind of intense experience, like Moses, for example, they are surrounded by light. So there is this notion of kind of light and awakening and enlightenment, even though it is not typically talked about in quite the same way in the monotheistic traditions. Of course, in other traditions around the world, and particularly some of the Eastern traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, there is also these very intense spiritual experiences, usually linked a bit more with the notion of consciousness, how consciousness is the essence of the universe, and basically reconnecting your consciousness to the consciousness of the universe, becoming one with that fundamental reality, is an essential aspect of Hinduism, and to a large extent Buddhism as well. The approach is a bit different. In Hinduism, certainly the idea of reincarnation and the progressive attainment towards enlightenment is very, very relevant. In Taoism, the notion of becoming part of the natural harmony and flow of nature is a part of what those intense spiritual experiences are about. In Buddhism, enlightenment becomes a very personal, self-reflective kind of experience brought about through some type of self-reflection process, meditation, for example, that leads a person to this new awakening, this new kind of enlightenment experience. And of course, in Zen Buddhism, an offshoot of Buddhism, there's often this idea that enlightenment comes about when you have this realization of a radical truth, that everything is essentially an illusion of the mind, and getting beyond that illusion, getting beyond that attachment to the things in the world is what leads us to that spiritual awakening, that spiritual enlightenment. Now, we've talked about some of these different approaches to thinking about spiritual experiences, and I'm going to talk about one more in a moment. But I want to digress for a second, because now we're starting to be able to see how we might start to connect the elements of these experiences to the brain. When we talk about consciousness, when we talk about a sense of connection with God, when we talk about various emotional aspects of these experiences, we can now start to turn to what's going on in different parts of the brain. There's a couple of very important areas of the brain that we're going to be talking about. So one to the left of your screen is a large area of our brain called the frontal lobe. And I sometimes refer to this as an attention area. It helps us to focus our mind, to focus our attention, to focus our consciousness on a practice like meditation, on an idea. It's involved in our executive processes, planning our day, thinking about what we need to do, thinking about our meaning and purpose, and so forth. The frontal lobes may even be involved in our sense of free will. So the frontal lobes are very important in that whole concentration, attention aspect of ourselves. Along the side of the brain is the temporal lobe, really in the center of this picture here. The temporal lobe is involved in a number of very important processes, including our visual system. Towards the top of the temporal lobe, in conjunction with the parietal lobe behind it, is our verbal conceptual area. So when we start to think about what are these definitions of spirituality and religiousness, if we have an experience and we try to relate that to a notion of God, this verbal conceptual area is part of that process. It helps us to understand what these experiences are about and brings them into our beliefs, brings them into our behaviors. The parietal lobe itself often functions as an orientation area. And what that means is it takes our sensory information and helps us to create our sense of self and how our self relates to the world. So going back to that diagram I just showed, if we have the self versus world, and then as there's this progressive connection between the self and the world, we think that we might find some things going on in this orientation area, in this parietal lobe, that might be very relevant. Now, if we get a little deeper into the brain, this person unfortunately is looking the other way. You can still sort of see where the frontal lobes are, but here is an image of the limbic system. This is a little bit more central in the brain. It's very much involved with the temporal lobe. And a couple of important areas of the limbic system are worth talking about, including the hippocampus and amygdala. These are very well-known structures. The amygdala tends to become active when something of motivational importance enters into our environmental, what we're looking at in the environment. So usually the amygdala is thought of as a fear area. So if something bad happens, somebody comes to attack us, a lion walks into the room, then the amygdala turns on to tell us this is something we have to pay attention to. But it turns out that the amygdala also turns on when important things happen and good things happen. So if a loved one walks into the room, or perhaps if you are experiencing the awe of God, the awe of the universe, the amygdala might be involved in this kind of very intensive emotional process. And the hippocampus, which is kind of right behind the amygdala, is also involved in our emotional processes, but then helps to write those emotional processes into our memory banks. And this becomes, again, very relevant in the larger context of spiritual experiences that, if it's this very intense experience, very emotional experience for the person, then it's remembered as being incredibly real. It becomes a fundamental part of the beliefs that are written into the neural connections of the brain, and it becomes part of the belief system of that individual. Some of these other areas are also involved in the emotional processes that we feel and help us, with the hypothalamus, for example, help to connect whatever we're thinking and feeling in the brain with what we feel in the body. So when you have a spiritual experience, it's not just in the brain, but you really feel it throughout your entire being. And that becomes, again, a very important part of what these experiences are all about. So, in kind of regrouping here, then we can talk about different elements of spiritual experiences. The cognitive, it could be a sense of clarity, a sense of understanding, a sense of wisdom. There can be various beliefs and the notion of faith that are fostered as part of these experiences. The emotions, I've already mentioned, things like joy, awe, peace, for example. Experiential elements, visual, auditory, for example, things that people feel, hear, see. A health impact. Does this change the way they feel about themselves? Does this reduce anxiety, depression, help them cope with whatever issues and challenges that they're facing? In fact, a lot of these experiences occur when people hit that proverbial rock bottom, where they're really struggling with life, they're really struggling with issues and problems that they're facing. And so, that there is that health aspect of it as well. And then, of course, the transformational aspect of these experiences is another fundamental part. Now, a lot of what I've already been talking about are a little bit, it's based on what we know about spiritual experience, what people have written. It's what's in the literature, both the spiritual, the religious, and even the psychological literature. But there's also a kind of overall just conceptualization. We can understand that a spiritual experience will have different emotions, different feelings, and so forth. But it doesn't, all of what I've just talked about didn't have anything to do with actual data that we could derive from what people say about their spiritual experiences. So about 10 years ago, actually, we started an online survey. We ran it for about 5 or 6 years. And since that time, we've been publishing the data from that survey. And a lot of this survey data is now in our book, the Varieties of Spiritual Experience. This online survey basically asked people about their most intense spiritual experiences, these enlightenment spiritual experiences. We did this in several different ways. We asked them for basic demographics. What was their religious background? What did they think, feel? Did they have medical conditions? Under what circumstances did the experience occur? And we actually asked them a whole bunch of questionnaires that got at their sense of spirituality, their psychological well-being, and so forth. But then we also gave them a box and we said, provide a narrative, describe for us what your experience was like. And overall, we got about 2,000 respondents to this particular survey. And there's some other surveys that are going on right now that I think are going to be really relevant in helping us to continue to advance our understanding of these experiences. But with our survey, we got a lot of great data. Like I said, we've been publishing it. And this was a word cloud that was put together based on the words that were most used. And I was very pleased and intrigued by the notion of reality and the realness of these experiences being very important. Of course, the word experience, very important. God, time, life, spiritual, as well as a smattering of others, understanding, meditation, something, getting to know something. And then also experiences, energy, a feeling, sense of love, peace, as I mentioned before. So this helps us to sort of support all of the things that I've just been saying, but now has this piece of data that goes behind it. And there are certain core components of these experiences. So even though there is a great deal of diversity, everybody's experience is unique, there are different core elements of these experiences that we can start to group together. And I think these are very important for us to understand because they are in many ways part of what define these intense spiritual experiences as what they are, as intense spiritual experiences. So this includes, it fell out into these 5 different basic domains. So a sense of intensity, a sense of clarity, a sense of unity, a sense of surrender, and a sense of transformation, but that permanence of that transformation. So let's break these out in a little bit more detail. I want to give you some actual examples, and then we'll talk a little bit about the brain areas that might be involved in these kinds of experiences. So this is the description, in my view, one of the better descriptions of the intensity of the experience. It was a 43-year-old male, and he said this. He said, "I, as an unnameable but individual being, was traveling down an infinite roller coaster like waves of pure white ecstatic light. The ecstasy was overwhelming and rose and fell in intensity with the waves of light. The light path seemed infinitely long in both directions. The sense of the being and the light was infinitely more real than anything I had ever experienced." So, you see so many words that are very intensified here: unnameable, ecstatic, pure, infinite. And that capitalization of infinitely more real was the person doing that. It was not me adding that in there. So they were really trying to emphasize this intensity, the incredibleness of this experience. And that to me is an important element of what these intense spiritual experiences are about. There's something about them that fundamentally differentiates them from the everyday experiences that we have, just walking around. Something clicks, something changes. There's a shift that says this is something that is profoundly different. Now, where does that occur? Well, we've talked a little bit about some of the areas of the brain where this might be associated with, particularly the limbic system, which tells us about the emotional content, but also writes them into our brain, into the memory banks, to store them as something which is fundamentally real. So this is the first brain scan that you're looking at. And this is from some of the earlier studies that we have done, where we take people who are doing different practices, having very intense spiritual experiences. And this is a kind of scan called a SPECT scan, which stands for single photon emission computed tomography. The colors on this scan represent the amount of activity. And in fact, specifically, they represent the amount of blood flow in the brain. So the more blood flow that you see in the brain, the different colors there are. And this has to do, what we do is we inject a small amount of a radioactive tracer that follows blood flow in the brain. And we inject them while they're doing these different practices, or at least while they're in different states. So the scan that you're looking at right now is actually the person's baseline scan. This is just at rest. They're not doing their spiritual practice. And the arrow is looking at the limbic areas, at the areas of the amygdala and the hippocampus. So you see they're red, the brain is on, but it's not really doing a whole lot. When the person is now deep in meditation, what we see is a very intense blob of red activity occurring right where that arrow is. So the amygdala, the hippocampus turn on. It signifies this experience as being a very fundamentally important experience for that person. And we think it is what correlates with this level of intensity of experience. Another aspect of these experiences is the sense of clarity. And what I mean by that is that the person says, I get it now. I understand the world. Everything makes sense. And it didn't make sense before. People talk about the veil being removed. However they describe it, it's that they now understand the world in a new way that they never had figured out before. And this was a description by a 37-year-old female scientist. And she said, everything in life seemed to click. I had this clarity, and it was as if I was looking at life from the inside out. Despite my trepidation, this experience seemed to satisfy my proof-oriented mentality with the concept of intuition. It was also as if my intuition from somewhere deeper had offered some sort of direct experience that offered up proof. So I find this fascinating because even though this is a scientist who feels like she should have data behind her, there's something fundamental to this experience where they say, it's coming from deeper inside, and it's telling me what the world is all about. It is offering up a proof, a sense of clarity. Now, where might this occur in the brain? Well, there's a very central structure, which I have not mentioned yet, where this arrow is pointing, which is called the thalamus. And as you can see, it's very centrally located in the brain. It connects different parts of the brain to each other. So many people think the thalamus is a very fundamental relay that helps us maintain our consciousness and just helps all of our perspectives and cognitive aspects of our brain work together. The thalamus is also one of the main routes of sensory information getting into the brain, particularly from the visual and auditory systems. So, in many ways, the thalamus is fundamental to our perceptions of reality and making sense of those. And here what you see is an individual at rest, And you can see that the activity in the thalamus is pretty comparable on both sides. But when the person goes into their deep meditative practice, their prayer state, and has their experiences, there's a shift of activity in the thalamus. One side now becomes much more active than the other. So if the thalamus is shifted by these kinds of practices, maybe that helps us to understand why there's a shift in this sense of knowing, this sense of understanding and wisdom that changes our perceptions of reality itself. There's the feeling of unity, and we've talked about this a little bit, that sense of the two circles of the self versus other, and they kind of come together. This has to do with a very common description among people who have had these intense spiritual experiences, the sense of oneness of all things, the oneness of God, the importance of God as some sort of unifying force in the universe. And we think that this has something to do with that orientation area of the brain. So if we look at the parietal lobe, here's another scan from one of our early studies. This was a Buddhist meditator. And you can see that where the arrow is pointing, which is the parietal lobe, it's at rest is about the same level of red as every other area of the brain. So it's about the same amount of activity. But when the person goes deep into their meditative practice after about an hour, very, very intensive experiences, what we see is that this parietal lobe starts to quiet down. Now it's all in kind of yellows. So the red areas are the most active, followed by the yellow, blue, and black. And now suddenly, you see all this yellow going on in this parietal lobe. So what we think is happening is that if this is the area that normally turns on when you have your experience of yourself and how you kind of differentiate yourself from the world around you, the decrease of activity in this parietal lobe is associated with a loss of the sense of self, a loss of the sense of differentiation between self and other. And this may foster that sense of connection between ourselves and other people who we might be congregating with and doing the practice with God, with the universe, whatever it is that person feels that sense of connection to. And here is the fourth element that we talk about, this sense of surrender. And what we mean by that is that the person, even though the person may be engaged in a practice like meditation or prayer, they're striving for enlightenment of some kind. There comes a point in these experiences where the person kind of lets go. They surrender themselves. They'll talk about letting go, releasing themselves, different words that all kind of mean that. And what it ultimately is that the person feels like they're no longer making this happen. It is something that starts to happen to them. They are kind of, along for the ride, and it is something that is just coming at them and they are just experiencing. So here's I thought a really wonderful description of this. It was a 48-year-old Catholic woman who said, "I surrendered everything, including my faith and my salvation, and only for one reason. I loved God so much that I would truly give up everything to be connected with him. I said yes, and in an instant, God returned everything to me transformed. From that day forward, a new relationship exists between God and me. It is ever present, no distance, no separation. I am not attached to doctrine, dogmas, or rituals. I see God's actions all around me." So actually, we see several different elements just in this one quote, the sense of surrender. She surrenders everything, and it just sort of comes at her. God comes at her and returns everything to her. But then there's that sense of oneness. There's no distance, no separation. There's a very powerful sense of of transformation and permanence that exists now going forward. And that does lead us into that final aspect of that, which is that sense of transformation. But before we get there, where is the sense of surrender? Where is that sense of kind of letting go? Well, in the frontal lobes, as I mentioned, normally they turn on when we are purposely doing something. In fact, a lot of our studies of different spiritual practices like meditation and prayer have involved the increase of activity in the frontal lobes. They turn on as we concentrate, as we focus our mind on the prayer, on the meditation practice. And in this particular resting state of the brain, you can see that there's some reds, some blushes of reds along the frontal lobe areas. Now, when the person gets deeply involved in the spiritual practice, what happens to these areas? Well, they kind of shut down again. They go into these kind of greens here on the scan. And what we're seeing is that the frontal lobe is actually quieting down. As the frontal lobe quiets down, the person begins to lose that sense that they are purposely involved. It starts to kind of take over them. And interestingly, there are other experiences. There are flow experiences that are have been referred to as being hypofrontal states where the frontal lobes drop. And so we think that this is a very important aspect of these experiences that, even though you might be striving for them through a specific practice, when it starts to finally happen to you, the frontal lobes start to quiet down, just like the parietal lobes quiet down. And, you lose that sense of self. The parietal lobes, the spatial representation of the self. And here it is more the volitional sense of self, that I'm in charge, I'm making things happen. We lose that as part of the experience. Now, as I mentioned, there is an overall transformational aspect of these experiences. So in our survey, we asked people, how did it change you? What happened to you? And what I think is really quite fascinating in this table here is how much better people felt many of the aspects of their life, their relationships, their fear of death, their sense of meaning and purpose in life, and of course, their religious and spiritual attitudes. For the most part, became substantially better. Over 90% said their sense of spirituality was better. And so, these are very transformational aspects of these experiences. But an important point of this table, and something that I think from a neurotheological perspective really needs to be explored in more detail, is this very small percentage of people who say things got actually a little bit worse. So the question is why? What exactly happened? Sometimes things get worse because they have this incredible experience, but they can't bring it into the way that they have been believing all along. And maybe, in fact, particularly with like family relationships or even their existing religion, it can be problematic. Their family may reject them because they had this incredible experience, and it just doesn't, people don't understand it. They don't understand why they have now been transformed and so forth. Sometimes people say that their previous religious beliefs couldn't contain this mystical experience. And so they struggle with their sense of religiousness, even though their sense of spirituality gets better. So these are some important aspects in terms of the transformational aspect. And of course, we then begin to ask, well, how does it actually change the brain going forward? And this also is an important part of trying to understand these experiences. But before we get to that, and perhaps I should have shown this slide a little earlier when we're talking about the different categories of these experiences, but this is actually what fell out of another way of looking and categorizing these experiences based on our survey. And so we actually did an analysis of all of these experiences to try to find out, what are there other specific characteristics in terms of the content of these experiences, not just the elements of unity and so forth, but although that was part of it, but can we differentiate them in other ways? And here we talk about three main categories of these experiences, which include the numinous experiences, which can be both numinous, revelatory, or even these sort of synchronicity experiences, many things kind of happening together. Mystical experiences, which we certainly have talked about, a sense of unity, losing the self, but also some of those aesthetic experiences and creative aspects through art and nature, for example, that can become a very intense spiritual experience for people. And then there are the what might be referred to as paranormal types of experiences, which can be both something known to the individual. It could be, for example, a ghost or spirit that the person knows. It could be, a deceased relative, or something completely unknown to them, some completely anomalous type of experience. So I think this is another really good way of trying to categorize these experiences. So we have sort of the how do the experiences relate across sort of the everyday to the mystical. We have the categorization of different elements that are part of each of these experiences. These still have to do with the intensity. When you have a paranormal experience, it feels incredibly real. So it's still that level of intensity. It still has a sense of, how are you connecting with this, and has this transformative aspect to it. So all of these different approaches to understanding the varieties of spiritual experiences are kind of different ways, different angles of looking at it, but they're all related to each other, and they tell the story of what these experiences are ultimately all about. And of course, we can not only look at what those experiences are, but try to look at them from the perspective of prevalence. How do these different types of experiences occur? How many people report them? Certainly far and away, the numinous experience, the numinous aspects of these experiences tend to be very common. But interestingly, paranormal experiences, and this makes sense when you think about some of the Gallup polls and so forth that have shown people who believe in ghosts and spirits and so forth, and have had those kinds of experiences, they are fairly common. And we concur with that based on the data that we got from our survey. So again, this is how we can start to get at the nature of these experiences, how they happen. We have information about when they happen for people. So more and more data from this neurotheological perspective can help us to relate these experiences to what's going on in the brain itself. Now, as I mentioned, the transformative aspect of all of these experiences leads us to thinking about, well, what's going on in the brain? If a person feels transformed, if it changes their life, what exactly happened there? And is it something that the brain was sort of always able to do? Is it something new? Is it a new rewiring of the brain? These are some big neuroscientifically oriented questions. And so we've done some longitudinal studies where we look at people today and we have them go through some practice or some retreat program, have some kind of experience, and then see, what has happened in the brain itself. So here are some SPECT scans from a study that we did of a meditation practice called Kirtan Kriya. It's a mantra-based practice, and we took, this was actually a study of older individuals who had never really meditated before. We said, we're going to teach you how to do this practice. We want you to do it for a daily practice for about 2 months, and then we scan them before and after. So there are 4 scans on this slide, and the A scan is the person's original resting brain scan. So this is just basically them coming in and what they look like when their brain isn't doing anything in particular. The B scan is after we taught them how to do the meditation for the very first time, and we have them go through the practice. And when they're doing the practice for the very first time, we scan their brain. That's the B scan. And we send them home. They do the practice. It's 12 minutes a day for 2 months. And they come back. The C scan is their resting brain again. So this is, again, just kind of coming in off the street, and we scan their brain, not doing anything in particular. And the D scan is now their final meditation practice. So the A and the C scans, at least in the context of transformation, are the most relevant here. On one hand, if you actually look more at the top of the brain, which is where the frontal lobe is, you can see in the C scan that there's this, a much more of this red activity. There's kind of curvilinear activity along the top and kind of curling into the top part of the brain that you don't see in the A scan. And we saw this in many of our individuals. And I should have mentioned earlier that all of these scans also have quantitation behind it. So it's not just me saying, oh, it looked more red or whatever, but these are radioactive counts that we can actually assess and quantify and do statistical analyses on. So that's all part of the research articles that we did as part of these studies. But going back to the scan here, so overall in these individuals, after they did this practice for about 8 weeks, they had increased frontal lobe activity, not while they were meditating, although that also is the case. And you can see that in the B and the D scans a little bit. But even at rest, their frontal lobe became more active. So, that means that they transform the way their brain is operating, not while they're meditating, but while they are actually just at rest doing whatever it is they do in their normal life. And it correlated with reductions in anxiety and reductions in depression and improvements in memory and cognition. And that makes sense because the frontal lobe, as I mentioned, is very involved in our cognitive processes. That actually helps to regulate our emotional processes. And if you can affect this kind of a change in, a 2-month period doing a meditation for 12 minutes a day, you can imagine what's going on in the brain of, Buddhist monks and nuns who have been doing these practices for 50 years for hours a day. It really transforms the way their brain operates. The other the arrow here is looking at the thalamus, our old friend, the thalamus. And in this particular individual, in the A scan, one side of the thalamus is a little bit more active than the other. But when they come back, in the C scan, it shifts. It's much more balanced. In fact, the other side may even arguably be a little bit more intense. And in the D scan, you can see that the other side does become much more active during the practice. So again, here you're shifting the activity in the thalamus, changing the way the thalamus works, and therefore changing the way this person sees reality, experiences reality, and thinks about reality. And again, if you can do this in a very short period of time, then we might be able to understand how these intense experiences and doing these practices over many, many years can really transform a person's brain. Now, of course, the one interesting question is that, this is over time, doing a practice repetitively over time. And studies have shown that long-term meditators have, different changes in their brain compared to non-meditators. But what's fascinating about these intense spiritual enlightenment kinds of experiences is that they actually can last literally moments and still seem to affect a long-term change in the brain. So we don't fully know that. The real challenge of studying that is that we never know exactly when those experiences are going to occur. And rarely do we have the before and after. Usually we get people after. So we are continuing to do research to try to explore that. And in fact, one of the studies that we did to try to get a picture of that, although, I think we were somewhat successful, but not fully successful, was a different kind of brain scan. This looks very weird. This is a brain scan, though, and this is actually looking at the dopamine and the serotonin areas. So I haven't really mentioned much about the neurotransmitters that are in the brain, but we've been talking mostly about the different parts of the brain and what they do and how they work. But ultimately, all of our thoughts, feelings, and experiences are mediated by different neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, and so forth. And these are what help the neurons to communicate with each other. So this is a particular kind of scan called a DAT scan, and it looks at both the serotonin as well as the dopamine areas. So the top two images are the dopamine areas of the brain in what's called the basal ganglia. And this was a study that we did of people going through a very intensive spiritual retreat program. It was based off of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And they go through, it's very immersive, very intensive meditation for about a week, every day, hours and hours a day. So what you see on the scan in the post-retreat scan is that there's less activity in these basal ganglia areas. It's sort of much more yellowy than red. Now, why is this important? Well, this was a pretty interesting finding, and it was a little counterintuitive to me until I hopefully have figured it out. What this tracer binds to is what's called the dopamine transporter. And what that does is it takes up excess dopamine that's left over after the neurons fire. Now, interestingly, if you block the dopamine transporter, you get some pretty unusual effects. In fact, the drug cocaine, this is exactly what it does. It blocks the dopamine transporter, and then you get this, flood of dopamine in the brain, and it creates this intense feeling of euphoria. Well, we've sort of done that naturally here, whereas we've kind of down-regulated the dopamine transporter. So what that means is that it's sensitizing the brain to the release of dopamine. And I think that this has some very important implications for understanding how meditation and other spiritual practices can facilitate, predispose, whatever term you want to use, people to have a very intense experience, a very intense spiritual experience, because it potentiates the effect of dopamine. So when they finally have their experience and there's this, maybe it's a mild to moderate flood of dopamine, the brain sees it as this very intense flood. And it helps to create that sense of intensity, that very powerful experience that the individual has. And the same is true in the serotonin areas, a little harder to see on these slides, but the serotonin areas also were potentiated, and therefore the effects of serotonin are greater after the retreat. And of course, all of the research that's now being done looking at psychedelics and the relationship between psychedelic experiences and spiritual experiences, which was also something that came out of our research in our survey. This has some very important implications for understanding the effect of serotonin on the brain and how the brain actually helps us to engage these kinds of experiences. So again, we have the ability to use these sort of neurotheological and ultimately neuroscientific approaches to understand the nature of these experiences and the transformational elements of that. So I want to shift briefly as we get to the conclusion here. I've been using the word neurotheology, but I actually never really defined it for you. So now that we've kind of are coming to the end, I do want to talk a little bit about what neurotheology is. I think, to me, I'm very excited about it. I think there's a great future for neurotheology as a field. It is a unique field of scholarship that seeks to understand the relationship specifically between the brain and theology, as the term would describe, but more broadly between the mind and religion. And what I mean by that is that the neuro and the theology sides need to be defined very broadly. So the neuro can be about consciousness, it can be about psychology, it can be about neuroscience as well. It can be about medicine and just the overall, interaction between the mind and body, for example. So all the different ways we get at sort of the brain and mind part of who we are. And then the theology side is not just theology, although we certainly can address how we engage different theological questions, but it is the study of religion, spirituality, beliefs, spiritual practices, and ultimately spiritual experiences. Now, on one hand, we can evaluate the effects of religion and spirituality on the brain. We can evaluate health-related effects associated with these experiences. So there's this whole continuum from the very esoteric to the very practical, which is also part of neurotheology. And one of the things that I really like to say about all of this is that neurotheology, to me, for it to really work as a field, has to be a true two-way street, meaning that it's not just science looking at religion, it's not just religion looking at science, but it's the two of them kind of working together to help us understand who we are. And even if you go back to some of the discussion that we've had today, in terms of looking at a brain scan and the sense of oneness or unity, it doesn't eliminate the importance or the value of what that experience is. It doesn't eliminate the realness of these experiences, and it certainly doesn't eliminate whatever may be spiritual, religious, based on our sense of consciousness, our soul. We don't understand what these relationships are all about. Some people who take a more materialistic view may say, "Oh, the brain created the experience," and that is a legitimate perspective to consider and argue. But I think for neurotheology to really work, we have to look at all the different perspectives. And while we might say, yeah, maybe it is possible that the brain creates these experiences, it's also possible that these consciousness and the mind, especially if there's a universal consciousness, creates the mind, creates the brain, and enables us to have these experiences. It's just like if I look outside and I see a car out there, on one hand, there's a car out there. So that's the reality that it's out there. But my brain is actually creating my perception of the car inside my head. So there's this constant interplay between the reality which is out there, which can be purely material, it can be purely supernatural, it could be some combination of all of them, as well as the reality that's going on inside of our brain itself, and where soul, consciousness, mind, and brain all fit. Again, these are some of the broader, more exciting questions for us to think about. And I think neurotheology just brings in this new perspective that we've never really had before of, well, what exactly is going on in the brain when we think about these questions? It even kind of elevates it to a meta level where we can ask the question about, okay, like what's the nature of free will and how much does our brain produce our free will? Is free will some aspect of consciousness? But by the way, how does our brain even start to think about the question of free will? Why do we think about the question of free will? And how do we use our cognitive and emotional aspects of our brain and our mind to address that question? So there's a lot of recursive kind of analyses that can be performed. And I think this is a real strength of what neurotheology brings to the table. So ultimately, I think neurotheology shows us that religious and spiritual experiences have a tremendous impact on the brain, have a tremendous impact on the person. They transform a person's views about reality, about relationships, jobs, religious and spiritual ideas, scientific ideas. There's just so much that happens to us when we have these experiences, and trying to link all of this together, to me, is a very important part of the future of neurotheology, as well as I mentioned earlier, not only looking at how good it all can be, but what happens when it goes bad, and are there ways of helping to kind of redirect people in positive directions that might be valuable so that they can really incorporate this in positive ways to make their lives better. And I think the ultimate conclusion to me, as I kind of gathered from reading through these couple thousand experiences and more so, as we continue to have the survey going, one of the things that was just striking to me is that, basically anyone can have these experiences. If you look at the people who are describing them, these are not necessarily the Buddhas of the world and the Mother Teresas of the world, the clergy, and so are the rabbis and imams and so forth. These are everyday people. And these are people who might be in pursuit of these experiences purposely, might not be in pursuit, and they just happen to them. And so, not only can anyone have them, but I think, again, part of what comes out of this, to me, in a very optimistic way, is that everyone can have them. And, one of my favorite ones was a guy who was like driving his truck down the street and suddenly just saw sort of the wholeness and the unification of the entire universe. He wasn't looking for it at all. And I think the idea that anyone and everyone can have these experiences is very profound, very important for us to realize, because, in the world today, with the divisiveness and all the people with different political perspectives and countries and all these different, the immense divisiveness that we see in the world, I do hope on a very optimistic level, that the idea that we can all find our way to having these kinds of experiences, see the world differently, and hopefully see the world in a more unified, more holistic, more, a way of bringing human beings together and bringing the world together, to me, is something that could be a very powerful and important part of what neurotheology brings to the table, as well as our study of the varieties of spiritual experiences. So I encourage you to take a look at the book and learn far more than I'm able to do in a 45-minute hour talk about all the different varieties of spiritual experiences, and tying it into some of the famous work of William James and his Varieties of Religious Experience, and talking about that whole sort of connecting it with the history of our analysis of these experiences. And for anyone who is ultimately interested in exploring neurotheology further, there are a number of books that I have been fortunate enough to be able to publish. Some look more specifically at our research, some talk more about neurotheology itself and what it is and how it works. So I'd certainly encourage all of you to consider exploring these different books and trying to understand where your own beliefs fit in the context of all of this discussion. And for those of you who are interested in continuing to follow the research that I've been involved in, get some of the research articles and so forth, you're welcome to go to my website, which is Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. You can find some of the articles, information about upcoming books and projects, as well as connect with me if you have some questions or things that you'd love to talk about. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that you can find all of this interesting and useful in the context of your own spiritual pursuits. And I look forward to being in touch with all of you and your group as well. I think it's so important for everyone to explore these kinds of questions and to continue down their own spiritual and scientific paths that hopefully lead all of us to a greater sense of knowledge and enlightenment. Thank you very much.